Welcome to the Brothers in Crime podcast.
We are brothers.
We talk about true crime,
We don't take ourselves too seriously.
and you shouldn't either.
We're talking about forensic experts gone bad. Is that what you'd say, Bob?
I don't know if they went bad or if they started off bad, but let's talk about something good to begin with. And that is great listeners like See Me Mac, who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, those are pretty helpful. Apple's algorithm, essentially, they're all about how many listens you have, but also how many reviews you have. So if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, if you take like 0.2 seconds and leave us a rating and maybe write a little something nice or funny on there, we'd be happy to give you a shout out. We do read those and we really appreciate them. But back from the good to the bad, like I said, we're going to talk about some forensic folks, and we're going to start off with one that I'm pretty familiar with, a guy named Fred Zain. But before we get into Fred, we need to talk about somebody who I feel really bad for and who's not a piece of crap. A guy named Glendale Woodall. What do you think of that name?
That's a heck of a name. Sounds like an author's name.
Right? I mean, it's kind of got that all-purpose vibe to it. My understanding is Glendale, which I feel like I need to say Glendale, not just Glenn. I think he was like a cemetery worker in Huntington, West Virginia. In 1987, he was convicted of multiple felonies, including 2 counts of sexual assault. I thought you'd have something to say. You just look like...
I'm waiting, because,
Okay,
we're talking about bad forensics, so I'm assuming right out the gate he ain't do it.
Yeah, see, I shouldn't have set it up. I should have got you, down the road a little bit. Anyway, Glendale, he was sentenced to a ton of time in prison as a result. I think his term was something like 203 to 335 years. So unless he turned into a vampire or Highlander, he was going to die in prison. During his trial, there was some forensic expert testimony that indicated, based on scientific analysis of semen recovered from the victims, quote, the assailants' blood types were identical to Mr. Woodall's. That was the testimony given at trial. This expert further testified that the combination of blood traits would statistically occur in only 6 of every 10,000 males in West Virginia. I see your hamster running a little faster on the wheel.
Well, I'm going back to it's identical. If I look at, you give me 2 separate vials of blood, they're identical, aren't they? They're red, they're wet, it's blood, right?
But what does identical mean? Yeah, that's a great point.
Right, and then when you said the statistical match, I was waiting for the, 1 in 2 billion. And instead you give me 6 in 10,000, which is unique, but that's not, he definitely done did it.
Right, well...
It's not even that it's his, much less that he done did the crime.
So during the appeals process, the Supreme Court of Appeals of West Virginia ordered more DNA testing that wasn't allowed during the trial. That testing conclusively proved that Glendale could not have been the perpetrator. So in 1992, 5 years later, his conviction was overturned and he regained his freedom, but not after spending, but this is after he spent 5 years in prison as a convicted sex offender. Now, as you can imagine, Glendale, that probably wasn't a good time and he wasn't too happy about it, and I don't blame him one bit. So when he got out, he hired an attorney to sue the state of West Virginia for false imprisonment. But what this lawsuit led to, what kind of opened up as a result of this, I don't think anybody could have foreseen or predicted.
Well, in hindsight, we can predict it very clearly.
That's exactly right. So during this lawsuit, and in case you don't know this, right, when you sue a big entity like a state or a corporation or whatever, generally they have insurance for things like lawsuits. And so the state's insurer conducted its own investigation, which they usually do, to kind of see, what do they think about what's going to go down here, sort of get their feelers out for which way this thing's going to go. And in the process of that investigation, what the insurer found led it to go to the state and say, hey, listen, this insurance policy limit of $1 million, you need to just offer that in a settlement. Like, you just make this go away. And after talking with Colonel J.R. Buckaloo, who was the superintendent of the Division of Public Safety at the time, that's what the state police used to be formally called, the state of West Virginia settled Woodall's case for that $1 million policy. Now, if you adjust that for inflation today, that'd be about $2.1 million in today's money.
And his freedom was taken away. I think he deserved every penny.
Yeah, so maybe you're wondering, what was it that the insurance company found that caused them to just say, hey, you know what, we want to unload our pockets and make this thing go away. Well, as part of its investigation, the insurer reviewed, among other things, the work of the chief of serology at the Division of Public Safety, and that was a guy named Fred Zain. And that's who we're talking about.
And I'm going to have a hard time not referring to him as Robert Zain.
Oh, a little Suits reference. Very nice, very nice. So, although Woodall's innocence was primarily confirmed through DNA semen tests that weren't allowed at his 1987 trial, a review of the non-DNA trial evidence showed that he was likely convicted on all sorts of tainted information from Zain.
Like what?
Zain had testified, for example, that it was, quote, highly unlikely a hair found in one rape victim's borrowed car could have come from any source but Woodall's blonde beard. But in a written report from March 1987, 3 months before the trial, Zain initially described the sample as a pubic hair, and he never bothered to compare it to the hair or to any hair from the man who actually owned the car that the victim had borrowed.
Okay, but if we're in like 1987, then we're talking about just that crappy hair analysis, not like getting DNA off of it.
Right, yeah, you're like holding it up and just looking at it and going, yeah, that looks like Bob's.
Right, yeah. So his logic is flawed here that the victim borrowed the car from somebody. We don't even check with the person that owns the car, see what their hairs look like.
Right.
Oh, nope, this is his.
Yeah.
Nice.
Exactly. There's a lot that I'm going to try to unpack here, and I'm going to kind of take you through different phases of it. So right now I want to talk about some of the lab people who worked with Zain. They had agreed that sometimes it seemed like he reported findings that they wouldn't have, but some of these lab employees that worked with him, they said they just kind of attributed that to differences in opinion or the fact that maybe Zain had more laboratory experience. One of them testified that after Zain left the serology lab, he rewrote one of Zain's reports because he disagreed with its conclusions. He also testified that he had been unable to find blood on a murder suspect's jacket. So it ends up getting sent to this place where Zain is in the future, and Zain, voila, finds a blood stain, and the blood stain just happened to test consistent with the blood of the victim.
Well, ain't that magic?
Right? Another worker said that at some point he began to have doubts about whether all of the tests for which results reported by Zain had actually even been performed. And this was based primarily on his sort of feelings that a large number of the tests appeared to have been done in a very short period of time. So just physically, it probably wasn't possible to do all these tests that he had supposedly done. Now, that lab tech also testified that at least twice after Zain left the lab, evidence on which he'd been unable to obtain any genetic markers was sent to Zain, who tested it, and again was able to magically find the genetic markers the prosecution was looking for. Another one of the employees said that eventually the employees just became so concerned in this serology department in West Virginia with the validity of his reports that they actually refused to testify in the cases involving those reports, and so Zain was forced to come back and testify in these cases even after he had left the lab.
So he makes a big old mess in West Virginia, and then he hauls out and gets hired in Bexar County, Texas as like the director of physical evidence, and West Virginia isn't getting the results. It isn't finding things in evidence, so they just ship it off to him at Bexar County, Texas, because he finds stuff that we now know doesn't exist. This sounds great. What could possibly go wrong here? What kind of background did this guy have that he was seen as such a hero, mentor, whatever?
It's a great question. During all of the review, it was uncovered through the litigation, and there was a lot of litigation revolving around this guy, that he had probably falsely testified concerning his academic credentials. So you say, oh my gosh. In a case, State v. William E. Smith, that took place in Raleigh County, West Virginia, Zain testified, quote, "My educational background is that I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a minor in chemistry." Now, he went to, West Virginia State University down in Charleston. That was where he went to school. And his undergraduate transcript in his personnel file reflected that he had a major in biology, but he had no minor at all. And you might say, okay, so he didn't minor in chemistry. Maybe he took a bunch of chemistry classes and just considered that he had a minor, even though he didn't officially have one. Well, that's a fair thing to think if you think the best of people, but we don't. And what was uncovered during all of this was that his transcript, he had registered a total of 9 times for chemistry courses. But his academic record was, I'll let you decide for yourself. He received an F in organic chemistry, and then when he retook it later, he managed to muster a D. He also received a D in organic chem lab, and then after withdrawing from an earlier course, got a C in general chemistry. In addition to that C in general chemistry, he also received a B in a 2-hour chemistry course entitled Qualitative Analysis. He got a B in a 3-hour course, General Chemistry Qualitative Analysis, and he managed to get an A in a 2-hour course also titled Quantitative Analysis. So it appears that he had about 10 hours of chemistry courses in which he received a grade of C or above. Probably not what you want in the guy who's the director of serology for an entire state's forensics lab. I don't know. What do you think, Bob?
I think I'd like somebody that did a little bit better, but then again, what's the saying? What do you call the person that graduates at the bottom of the class in medical school?
I mean, that's fair. I'll also throw out there that he got an F in zoology, a D in botany, and a D in college algebra, and a D in genetics. So just to give you a flavor for what kind of academic record Zain had, that's what he had.
He's didn't do very well academically, then lied about it. Just loving this.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that in the state of West Virginia, there is one state crime lab, and it is in Charleston, and that's where this guy was. So prosecutors, police departments from all over the state, if they're sending any evidence to the state crime lab, which that's what most of them do most of the time, this is where it's going. So him being the director of serology for the state crime lab, there's one lab. All of the, so you're talking about, a lot of evidence, a lot of cases.
Yeah, everything that happens in the state. And the West Virginia State Crime Lab has enjoyed a pretty good reputation.
Yeah, so I think let's talk about some of the cases that are sort of illustrative of the types of activity that Zain engaged in.
All right, don't get us in the weeds here, but I'm down for it. Just don't get us in the weeds.
All right, well, I'll try. So if this becomes too much, just tell me to move on. So in State v. Gerald Wayne Davis, and I'm referring to a report that was born out of a review of all of his work, right? So these are going to be cases that were featured in the report as ones that they looked at and identified issues. It says the reported results showed an ABO type foreign to both victim and defendant. The remaining marker was identical to the victim. This would normally be interpreted as excluding defendant as the semen donor. The report incorrectly implied a match between the semen and the defendant. The ABO mismatch was dismissed as bacterial contamination by Mr. Zain. However, no satisfactory foundation for that opinion was found in the laboratory records, nor the transcript of testimony. If the ABO result is discounted, the correct conclusion is no information regarding the semen donor. So it went from what should have been essentially reported and testified to as no information to this is the guy who did it. In that case. In State v. David McDonald, the report said, quote, many of the samples gave no results with some markers, but a result was listed on the worksheet. ABO types were listed for all samples on the worksheets. However, no ABO typing was found for this case in the data sheets. So there you have, information being indicated or put down as like the final reports. But then when you go and look at like the data set for where these tests would have actually been performed, essentially there is no data.
Is this the guy that a couple of lab scientists that worked with him said that they witnessed him looking at a blank slide and writing down conclusive results?
That is correct. Yep, that's this guy.
I mean, if that's not, he's just dirty. Just freaking dirty.
So, I'm going to fast forward down. I've got a bunch of these, but I'm going to go down here to the last one. It says, in State v. James E. Richardson, the report said, there's no evidence that Lewis testing was performed on the swab, but the report implies that it was. The conclusion did not include any frequency, but a transcript was reviewed to see how these results were explained in court by Mr. Zain. He incorrectly multiplied the non-secretor frequency by 50%.
Oops.
Since the stain included semen from males only, and finally by the PGM 1+ frequency, even though there may have been masking by the victim's PGM type. That the semen could not have originated from a secretor based on the absence of any blood group factors is not a certainty, as stated in his testimony.
Oops.
The value of the serological testing was overstated in both the report and testimony. So consistently, case after case after case, he's going from everywhere from kind of making up things that are, he's bolstering testimony that really has very limited value, to just making things up out of, thin air.
Okay, so I know at some point here he ended up leaving West Virginia and going to Bexar County, Texas. But like, how did did West Virginia fire his ass and then he just scammed Bexar County, or how did that?
It's a great question, and clearly you knew more about this case than I thought. So I had this great reveal planned where I was going to shock you with the fact that he went from being this turd in West Virginia, and then he goes on to become the chief of physical evidence. This has an X, but you're saying it's Bexar County? I would have totally butchered this. So.
Yeah, I don't know how they came up with that. There's probably some history or a name or somebody, but it's spelled Bexar County, and it's pronounced Bexar County.
Yeah, I would have blew that. I'm glad that I'm glad you got ahead of me. So,
well, I know that because I'm a pretty big fan of Dr. G, medical examiner, and she started out in Bexar County, Texas.
Good to know.
So I saw it written and had her explain it.
X don't make that sound.
Right. I would have totally the first time I saw it, I'm like Bexar, but they're calling it Bexar. And also, San Antonio is in Bexar County.
That's a great thing to point out. I'm glad you pointed that out for the listeners who might not know. And I didn't know until I was, reviewing for this. So that's really helpful. So, so they don't fire him. He worked as a serologist for the West Virginia State Police from 1980 to 1989. He resigned. He moves to Texas in that county that San Antonio's in, Bexar County, where, like I said, he becomes the chief of physical evidence at the medical examiner's office.
And West Virginia knew he was a problem.
So what's interesting is
before he left, right?
Yeah, there was writing on the wall in about 85. There were some issues where I think he went to some kind of FBI academy type training, and at these classes, essentially what they recognized there was this dude has no idea what he's doing. He's an idiot, and so they kind of sort of filter that back, but. That's taken with a grain of salt, and you can imagine you've got state police and FBI, and sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not, whatever. And then there's some other people who make some noise, but again, these coworkers are sort of well, everybody likes him. And remember, the prosecutors, when they go to this guy, well, man, he finds the bloodstain that nobody else can find. So guess what? He's really popular.
You got a problem when you got a forensics person that's a prosecutor's.
What, right?
I don't mean friend in a social way. I mean, you got somebody that is
you want that
favorable to the prosecution more so. That's.
Yeah. Well, I want to have a discussion with you when we get a little later into these about some overall things. But let's get back to this. So to your point. They don't fire him. He resigns. And I think it's fair to say that by 1989 when he leaves, he kind of sees the writing on the wall, right? He knows to some extent that there's some people who are starting to get a little bit suspicious or just kind of aren't a big fan of what he's doing. Now, is that why he left? I can't say that. I don't know. But maybe it factored into his decision. But so he heads down to Texas and he's got this role that, this isn't any better, right? So without getting into the weeds as much in the Texas stuff, an investigation in Texas found that while he was working with the Bexar County Medical Examiner's Office, that he had engaged in misconduct and fraud that might have resulted in as many as 180 wrongful convictions. Just like in West Virginia, the Texas investigation found numerous instances of filing reports on tests that he had never even done, reporting negative results as positives, and even describing inconclusive results as conclusive. So all this kind of stuff. You know what? I want to skip ahead a little bit and talk about... So West Virginia, as sort of a response to when this kind of breaks open, which it breaks open due to the Woodall investigation, they take some measures to try to, remedy's not the right word, but based on what has happened, they're kind of like, oh, we have to, this isn't just, your run-of-the-mill thing. We've got to really do something about this.
Yeah, we've ignored it this long, so now we need to go back and look at everything this fool touched.
Yeah, and
see if it was right or not.
Right, and so what happens is this kind of ends up in front of the Supreme Court of West Virginia in their jurisdiction as somebody needs to do an intervention is kind of how I would describe it. And so there's the Supreme Court has issued these opinions, Zain 1, Zain 2, Zain 3, and so from Zain 1, at the outset, the way the court explains it, they say this case is an extraordinary proceeding arising from a petition filed with this court on June 2nd, 1993, by William C. Forbes, prosecuting attorney for Kanawha County. This is the county where Charleston, the state capital, is, requesting the appointment of a circuit judge to conduct an investigation into whether habeas corpus relief should be granted to prisoners whose convictions were obtained through the willful false testimony of Fred S. Zain, a former serologist with the Division of Public Safety.
I mean, anytime you're appointing a judge to investigate, that's a little outside the norm.
Right? Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is, and there's a lot, so I don't think I have it in there. So, so there ends up being this special judge who was a retired circuit court judge. He gets appointed to kind of sit over this, and then they have a special prosecutor to represent the state's interest, and then they appoint, I think it was like the chief public defender for Kanawha County ends up getting appointed to kind of represent the interests of all of these people who at this point just kind of, I'm sure there's murmurings about it, but are waiting to see like, well, how bad is it, right? So this report gets generated based on this investigation, and as part of the report, there's findings of this guy, James McNamara, who's the lab director of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, another guy named Ronald Linhart, who's supervisor of serology at the crime lab for the LA County Sheriff's Department. And those two guys were selected by this dude who's the chairman of the Laboratory Accreditation Board of the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors.
Damn.
That's a mouthful. So they get this guy who's totally, unbiased, whatever, to pick some people to come in and do a review who are science people who can look at all this and kind of make sense of it for the non-science people, essentially. And so they're tasked with conducting an analysis of the policies, procedures, practices, and records of the serology division during Trooper Zain's tenure. Then you get the court issuing sort of its decision or its, here's what we're going to do based on the report that comes from the judge. So now we're talking about the Supreme Court reviewing all of these findings.
Okay.
And so I'm pulling from that to kind of give you just an overview of like what the conclusions are as a result, a little less than a decade of Zain being in charge of the serology department there. So it goes on to say like, and I really like the language the court uses here because I think it's appropriate. They say the matters brought before this court by this special judge are shocking and represent egregious violations of the right of a defendant to a fair trial. They stain our judicial system and mock the ideal of justice under law. We direct Prosecutor Forbes to pursue any violation of criminal law committed by Trooper Zain and urge that he consult with the United States District Attorney for the Southern District of West Virginia. We direct our clerk to send all relevant papers to both of them. This conduct should not go unpunished. This is really strong language.
Right.
I mean, for a court to say, like, go get this guy.
Right. That's jumped out at me. This should not go unpunished. It's not like if proven
right.
Or these allegations, it's this shit he needs to be in trouble for.
Right, exactly. So they go on to say, this corruption of our legal system would not have occurred had there been adequate controls and procedures in the serology division. Judge Holliday's report is replete with the deficiencies and derelictions that existed and as were uncovered by the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, whose team reviewed the forensic data. To ensure that this event does not recur, we direct the superintendent of the Division of Public Safety, now we would just call them the state police, to file with the clerk of this court a report outlining the steps that are to be taken to obtain certification of the State Police Forensic Laboratory by the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors. We direct that this report be filed within 60 days from the date of the entry of this opinion. So they ain't playing around. They're like, you're going to fix it, and you got 60 days to tell us how you're going to fix it.
Good.
So now I want to get into some of the actual details of the report that Judge Holliday uncovered it through this investigation done by these forensic folks. So it goes on to say that there's these multiple findings of fact regarding Trooper Zain's long history of falsifying evidence in criminal prosecutions. Let me say that again. His long history of falsifying evidence in criminal prosecutions.
Ridiculous.
Specifically, now this is straight from the report, what they found. It says, quote, the acts of misconduct on the part of Zain included 1. Overstating the strength of results. 2. Overstating the frequency of genetic matches on individual pieces of evidence. 3. Misreporting the frequency of genetic matches on multiple pieces of evidence. 4. Reporting that multiple items had been tested when only a single item had been tested. 5. Reporting inconclusive results as conclusive. 6. Repeatedly altering laboratory records. 7. Grouping results to create the erroneous impression that genetic markers had been obtained from all samples tested. 8. Failing to report conflicting results. 9. Failing to conduct or to report conducting additional testing to resolve conflicting results. 10. Implying a match with a suspect when testing supported only a match with the victim. And 11. Reporting scientifically impossible or improbable results.
Nice.
You got any thoughts about that?
I think that's ridiculous. I'd like to know, I mean, so what this tells us is not only was this guy an idiot, as the FBI figured out, and his coworkers and his transcripts reveal, not only was he not that smart, but he was also blatantly dishonest. Mm-hmm. So you can't just blame it on, I didn't know no better. But how in the hell does a Department of Public Safety crime lab end up hiring a guy on bad false credentials that's not a very good student, doesn't seem to know what he's doing, turns out he's lying the whole time, and this goes on in the crime lab for years and nobody finds it? Like that's not how science is supposed to work.
Yeah, that's a really...
Definitely not when you're using science in the criminal justice system, which is called forensics.
That's a great point, and that ties really nicely into where I want to go next. Even, I don't know if you did on purpose, but thank you. So the report, real quick though, the report did, to your point, it said this is a systemic practice rather than an occasional inadvertent error.
Right.
Right. And so they went on to say that many of his former supervisors and subordinates regarded him as, quote, pro-prosecution.
That's the word I was looking for earlier. Not
right.
Prosecutor's friend. Pro-prosecution.
Yeah. But then they go on to say, like, it appears that Zain was quite skillful in using his experience and position of authority to deflect criticism of his work by subordinates. So even though he admittedly beyond the scope of the investigation, the report by the judge noted that there was evidence that Trooper Zain's supervisors likely just ignored or concealed complaints of his misconduct. It also discusses these criticisms from the ASCLD of certain operating procedures, which I'm going to get into next. But it seems that he apparently was just really, really good deflecting and sort of explaining things away. And also, once he became the chief or the director or whatever, then it just became this matter of like, well, I'm the guy, so don't question me.
It sounds like this was like a whole thing, a whole perception around him of, oh, he's been doing this for a long time and he's well known and respected in this community. You're not gonna challenge him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair.
You know, nobody's so if some dude that's been on the job a couple years comes in and says, hey, he's doing some stuff that doesn't look right to me. First of all, that dude might not even believe, like, be in disbelief himself that, like, I can't believe. This is the freaking man, and I can't believe I'm seeing him look at a blank slide and write shit down that says the dude's guilty. So then he goes to somebody, and the boss or whatever, and the big boss is like, look, dude, old Zain here, he's been doing this a whole lot of years. He's the shit. You've been on the job a couple years, like, you're misunderstood. You're not seeing something right.
Yeah, because who would believe that anybody would actually do that?
Nonetheless, there got to be a process of checks and balances so that this shit cannot happen.
That's exactly right. And so the report concluded that this lack of, or these procedural deficiencies contributed or led to an environment within which Zain's misconduct escaped detection. That's the words they used. So let's talk about...
I said that, just not as pretty.
Well, yeah, you did. I mean, it was solid. So let's talk about these procedural deficiencies. They list them out. There are 10 that they concluded or found. They said, 1, no written documentation of testing methodology.
Oh, that's handy.
2, no written quality assurance program.
Even better.
3, no written internal or external auditing procedures.
You don't need one because he's the king.
You're just making it up. 4, no routine proficiency testing of laboratory technicians.
Because he couldn't pass any of them.
Right. 5, no technical review of work product. 6, no written documentation of instrument maintenance and calibration.
Oh, Lord.
7, no written testing procedures manual.
Oh, Lord.
8, failure to follow generally accepted scientific testing standards with respect to certain tests. 9, inadequate record keeping. Shocker. 10, failure to conduct collateral testing.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah, essentially...
They weren't doing anything right.
Yeah, it was just the Wild West of forensics, if you could even call it forensics, honestly.
Yeah, you send some stuff off to Zain, and he'll tell you that it's the suspect and testify in court.
Right.
Great.
And so the Supreme Court found that the special judge's report correctly concluded that Trooper Zain's pattern and practice of misconduct completely undermined the validity and reliability of any forensic work he performed or reported. I don't know how you come to any other conclusion, right?
Right.
So, without getting too into the weeds on the legal stuff, essentially what came out of this was the Supreme Court in its decision said any case where he's offered testimony, we don't need to go into the weeds on whether that the value or quality of that testimony in each case. We're just going to say as a matter of law that as courts review these convictions, anything that Zain said, throw it out. It's garbage. You got to assume it's tainted and it's trash.
Fair. I mean, that's the way it should be.
Right.
I agree.
And so I'm going to oversimplify this, but essentially what happened with the courts was they said, so you got to look at the case and you say, if Zain testified, if he touched the case, if he worked on it, take whatever he did, throw it out. Now look at what's left. Could any conviction stand on its own based on what's left? If not, they get a new trial. If yes, then their conviction stands, essentially.
But they could still individually appeal, couldn't they? Or no?
Right. No, yeah, they're challenging. It's a matter of individual challenging. This was direction for the lower courts. So, let's say you were imprisoned and Zain testified in your case. The Supreme Court was giving direction on all right, lower court, this is how we're saying you have to handle it.
Right.
When you review Bob's conviction, if Zain testified or worked on the case or whatever, take all that and get rid of it.
Right. You don't have to go through the process of determining in each case, was the evidence he provided or the testimony he provided, was it accurate? You just assume from the jump that it was BS.
Exactly. Which is, that's a huge, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a little strange for you lawyers to do something that efficient and sensible.
That's fair. So as a result of all this, kind of down the road, Zain ends up getting charged with lying in court and tampering with evidence in his labs. There's an article. Well, let me back up just a second. In all that, there's a bunch of legal challenges with that. I think initially the indictment in his case gets thrown out, then it gets reinstated by the Supreme Court. The legal battle kind of drags on for a number of years. In an article, though, about Zain and all that stuff, Jack Buckaloo, the guy who was the kind of superintendent of the state police, he had said, and I'd like you to read this part.
I get to read Buckaloo?
Yeah.
I have no idea why he did what he did. The only possible reason I can speculate on is to enhance his status with prosecutors by saying what he thought they wanted him to say.
Yeah, so that was the best guess that the superintendent had. So Zain, at the age of 43, surrendered on August 4th in Hondo, Texas, to answer charges of aggravated perjury, evidence tampering, and fabrication connected to the 1990 rape conviction of Gilbert Alejandro.
Who the hell is Gil Alejandro?
Oh, I'm getting there. Just hang on a second. An attorney for Zain said that he thought there's no criminal intent in any of this. You got
horseshit.
I kept that in there just for you.
Horseshit.
Unsurprisingly, Zain refused to talk to reporters, and he left Medina County Jail after posting a $6,000 bond.
Oh, jeez.
He had a trial and all that set, and so at that time, Texas had already freed, at this point in history, which is back when we're in the early 2000s here, Texas had freed 2 men convicted on now disproven blood tests done by Zain. Alejandro, who I mentioned, he'd served 4 years of a 12-year sentence, and Jack W. Davis, who'd been convicted of murder in 1990. Davis missed a death sentence by 1 vote. 1 juror voted not to have him put to death, and that's the only reason he didn't receive a death sentence.
Oh, damn.
So Davis sued Zain for $10 million. Don't blame him. And after Davis's conviction, Zain changed his testimony about blood at the scene of a teacher's mutilation murder, acknowledging that the blood came from the victim rather than Davis.
No.
Seems like that's, So, Zain's work or testimony also, again, figures to just be part of hundreds of other Texas cases. And the Texas courts, they had to kind of follow suit like West Virginia and do the same kind of thing. I'm not going to get into all that because, you basically can understand what happened. But I'm curious. So Zain was fired from his Texas job in July of 1993 when all the stuff came out about everything that had happened in West Virginia.
Is that when he was arrested?
He ends up getting arrested. It might have been around then. In Texas, but then he ends up fighting his legal stuff in West Virginia years down the road. But do you care to guess where he fled to whenever he got fired from Texas? He went to another state. You care to guess where he went?
I guess Mexico.
No, it was in the United States.
Oh, no, I have no idea then.
Florida. He moved to Florida.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Please tell me he didn't get a job as a director of forensic lab.
I can confirm that did not happen. Thankfully, I think once the West Virginia stuff came out, his forensics career came to a halt. Now, let's see. I'm going to skip all that. Okay. Now, you asked me about Mr. Alejandro, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, I just to give you just a little sliver of some of what happened in Texas, in case you thought maybe things were better in Texas or he had cleaned up his act or whatever, which I've probably given you enough preview you figured out it wasn't. I have a little excerpt here from the Innocence Project write-up on Mr. Alejandro's case. It says he was convicted of aggravated sexual assault in Uvalde County, Texas in 1990. He ended up getting released in 1994, one of many innocent men who'd been convicted due to this false testimony by Fred Zain. The crime took place in the victim's apartment, where she was pulled inside the door, raped while her face was covered with a pillow, and threatened with death if she should call for help. The victim described her attacker, whom she glanced at during the attack, as Hispanic, about 6 feet tall, and wearing a white cap. Although police questioned a man who was wearing clothes similar to this description, no arrest was made. Instead, the police charged Alejandro with the crime several months later. The victim failed to identify Alejandro in several photo lineups. She made one identification from a sketch lineup and later identified him in a live lineup. The most damaging testimony, however, came from Fred Zain, who reported that DNA testing he performed on the evidence conclusively matched Alejandro. In cross-examination, Zain reiterated his findings and pronounced that he was absolutely sure of his results and his testimony. A subsequent re-examination of the DNA report yielded completely different results. Testing had not even been completed when Zain issued his report. Let me say that again. Testing wasn't even finished when Zain issued his report in this case. The final test results, completed after the trial, revealed that Alejandro was in fact excluded as the depositor of spermatozoa on the victim's clothing. Based on these test results, Alejandro's conviction was overturned and he was freed from prison, but not before he'd spent almost 4 years in prison on this 12-year sentence that he received. Like I had mentioned, he filed that lawsuit for $10 million. It was ultimately settled for $250,000.
Probably some insurance company, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it sounds like that's probably the case, because I'm sure that's the policy limit, and that's pretty open and shut. I don't think it gets much worse than testifying that the DNA is his when you haven't even gotten the results back yet, and then the results come back and it's not him.
Right, and sitting there testifying that he's absolutely positive in his results. Come on, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you made them up.
Exactly. So, all in all, my understanding is West Virginia alone eventually ended up paying about $6.5 million to settle lawsuits by people who had been convicted wrongfully due to Zain. That doesn't account for what they paid him for his work that clearly was not real, or what they spent on trials that he ruined, frankly. I can't even begin to guess the amount of, and this is not the most important thing, but just working my way up to it, the amount of money that was wasted because of this man. Then you get into the amount of time and people's lives that were ruined and messed up and just,
right. And the families of those people, their lives were forever affected.
The victims who didn't get justice because the people who actually did it were never caught or weren't caught for years, and maybe other victims who were...
Right. Additional crimes that occurred because the real perpetrator wasn't stopped.
Right. Yeah. So all that. Zain ends up, he's got these charges that I mentioned, I think in West Virginia, that kind of lingered on for a bit. In 2001, he was charged with some obtaining money by false pretenses. The jury deadlocked in that case. This is all fraud stuff. So then a new trial was scheduled for July 2003. However, Zain, who was living in Ormond Beach, Florida, died in December 2002 from liver cancer.
Well, normally I think cancer is a horrible thing to die from, but this messed up so many people's lives, whatever.
I thought you'd have something a little stronger to say than that. You were kind there. You kind of played it down a little bit. Yeah, so Fred Zain, he's a one-off case, right? He's the only forensic expert who's ever done anything crazy like this, right? There can't be more people like this out there, right?
No, unfortunately, there are plenty more people. There's the one in Colorado. There's the Mary Jane or Mary Jo lady in Virginia that's completely off her rocker.
Wait, there's more?
Oh, there's lots more.
Well, then I guess we're just going to have to cover that in the next episode.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us on the Brothers in Crime podcast. Feedback and suggestions are always welcome. For links and resources related to this episode, please see the show notes or visit us at brothersincrimepodcast.com. We hope you'll save, subscribe, or bookmark us on your favorite podcast site and join us for the next episode.